I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is with me. Gordon, I want to turn immediately to several items in Asia because later on this evening we're calling Japan, we're calling Beijing, we're also talking to Toshi Yasuhara, the distinguished professor at the Naval War College who writes in Red Star Over the Pacific about the Chinese Navy's aggressions in the East China Sea. Right now, I want to address the large dragon called inflation. We've talked about it for several weeks. The Chinese food inflation seems to be the most alarming. What does the inflation picture mean to the Chinese leadership in Beijing?
Ultimately, this is a question of political stability, because what we have seen in 1988 was essentially mismanagement of growth. And because there was so much inflation, people took to the streets. People gathered in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989, and they talked about democracy. But what got them there really was the problem with prices going up, and especially food. And what we saw in November last month, 11.7% inflation on food year on year. That followed 10.7% or 10.1% in October.
Now, the Chinese inflation right now is acknowledged by Premier Wen, and he is ordering various techniques. One they're using is to increase the demand, the amount of money that the banks hold against their loans, up to, I think, 18 or 19%. Is that enough, sufficient to fight this inflation?
What they're doing with the bank reserve ratios is needed, but certainly it's not sufficient. We've seen a pattern, not only in the late 1980s, but also in the early 1990s, which preceded another bout of inflation, where the Chinese government took minor steps to try to rein in price increases. They were not enough, and what happened is inflation went out of control. In 1994, inflation was 21.7%. And right now, inflation is much higher than the 5.1% that the Chinese government is claiming, because even the Chinese Academy on Social Sciences, which is especially prestigious, said that the inflation numbers from the National Bureau of Statistics are understated by at least 7%.
If we had 5% inflation, 11% food inflation, Ben Bernanke would immediately raise the rates very quickly, bang, 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 and the governors would go along with it because that is a picture that is a nightmare. That takes us back to the Jimmy Carter administration in the late 70s. Does China have a comparable independent Federal Reserve System?
No, there's no independent anything in China. Essentially, this is Premier Wen Jiabao is going to make a decision on interest rates, and essentially they've raised interest rates once since December 2007. It was not nearly enough. Everyone had expected an interest rate increase about 4 or 5 days ago. It didn't occur, and that's creating some pessimism about the economic management of the country because people realize that the premier is not taking forceful enough steps to keep inflation in check.
Puzzle. Do they know something and therefore they're being mild in their response, or are we seeing the limits of the cadres? In other words, have we caught them being backwards and ill-informed, and they're not moving quickly?
Well, you could make the argument that 5.1% inflation, as bad as it is, because their target for the year is just 3%.
Right.
You could say, well, it's not as bad as it was in 1993, 1994. It's not as bad as it was in 87, 88, and 89. But the problem here is I think that because of the ongoing political transition, where the fourth generation leaders are going to give way to the fifth at the end of 2012, according to the schedule, means that nobody really wants to take a bold decision. Nobody wants to slam on the brakes, because if you slam on the brakes, the economy could sort of go in reverse, and no one wants to be responsible for that.
Rare earths, we've talked about them over the last months, and there was contretemps in October and November with regard rare earths being exported to Japan, and then there were mixed messages coming out of Beijing about whether rare earths were or were not going to be exported according to a schedule and according to quotas. We've reached the end of the year. There were complaints about environmental factors, there were complaints about shipping. But right now, the United States is responding to this by hurrying up Molycorp Corporation, the only mine that we have for rare earths in California that was closed by our EPA. I don't want to focus on the U.S. fix. I want to ask about the Chinese ambitions, do they mean to use rare earths as leverage over the United States and our allies in Asia?
Well, they've already done it this year. In September, they cut off the export of rare earths to the Japanese in connection with that dispute over the Senkaku Islands. And then, just 3 or 4 weeks later, they cut off rare earth exports to the United States and to the European Union. So they're already trying to use it as leverage.
And do you believe that this is a conscious policy that is united with, say, the inflation concerns, the currency disputes, the aggression in East China Sea and South China Sea, or are these disparate factors in the cadres? I try to imagine them, and I don't think of them as a wiring diagram. I think of them as feudal dukes who are all controlling different ministries, and that they don't meet and don't coordinate. How to picture this, Gordon?
This is a real puzzle, because what we have seen over the last 18 months or so is China going into reverse on almost everything. And so you can't say, in a sense, that one is connected to the other, because you can't see the connections, but you can see the overall trend of everything. And that means that there's a real problem in the political system in China. And so in a general sense, they are definitely connected. And this is something we've got to be worried about, starting from A and going all the way to Z.
You mentioned the challenge in the East China Sea. We're talking to Toshi Yashihara later on in the show just about that confrontation. We've not talked about it for many weeks. There are islands that are cross-claimed. They are Japanese islands, and they're cross-claimed by the Chinese. Do those islands represent the same kind of obsessive, self-destructive policy that we see in Taiwan? Taiwan's a much larger state, but once the Chinese cadres at the PLA, Navy, or in Beijing, once they get focused on an aggressive policy, they don't seem to have a way of governing themselves. They're continually aggressive, and they compete with each other.
You know, it used to be 4 or 5 years ago, China settled some of its territorial claims with other countries, and it actually was quite generous in some of those instances. But what we have seen over the last 2 years is China unable to compromise on any territorial claim, even the ones that are totally ludicrous, like the ones in the South China Sea. And essentially, China's tone has become incredibly belligerent, and that is giving pause to everybody in the region, and it's meant that countries have started to turn to the United States, really looking for protection.
Later on tonight, we're also going to speak with our colleague Bruce Bechtel about North Korea. At this point, Gordon, there are all these stories coming out about North Korea's nuclear ambitions, and that it is far more sophisticated. We see the story in the New York Times by their lead correspondent David Sanger and others, far more sophisticated and advanced in their quest for a uranium-based bomb, that could be miniaturized. Do we believe that that is a cooperation with the Chinese PLA and that that's part of their aggression?
Absolutely, because in 2002, for instance, Pakistan transferred these advanced P-2 centrifuges to North Korea, and what they did was the Pakistani Air Force planes refueled in the Chinese city of Guangzhou. So China's two closest allies were dealing in China's most sensitive technologies, and they were using even Chinese military facilities to implement the exchange.
Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.